Hi guys, Mrs. Carraz here. Today we're looking at Chapter 3, Section 4, the Southern Colonies. So the Southern Colonies are Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. If we're looking at the geography of the Southern Colonies, so there's a tidewater region, which consists of like low flatland with swampy areas around it. And if we're thinking about the climate of the Southern Colonies in general, there's a hot, humid climate that provides a really long growing season for crops like tobacco and rice. These crops require a lot of workers, and as we'll see in a few slides, this really contributes to the growth of slavery in North America. These crops you'll see also referred to as cash crops. They're in very high demand, which means you would sell them for quite a bit of money. So the Mason-Dixon line is super important. This is our introduction to it, and it will carry us through the Civil War as far as being super significant. So during the 1760s, there was a border dispute between Maryland and Pennsylvania. And obviously we're pretty far from the 1760s at this point in history, but that's okay. Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon were two surveyors who worked together to find the real border. And that border was named after them. It became known as the Mason-Dixon line. Even though the Mason-Dixon line technically was just established to tell the difference between Maryland and Pennsylvania, where does one stop and the other one start, later, or on a bigger scale, the Mason-Dixon line is used to separate the North from the South. So if you live above the Mason-Dixon line, you are considered North. If you live below it, you're considered South. And during the pre-Civil War era, which we'll get to later this year, that line was used to differentiate between the southern states who allowed slavery and the northern states who would abolish it. We'll see the role this plays moving forward, not just in this debate over slavery, but in the Civil War and even more to come. Moving on to Bacon's Rebellion, which is not as delicious as it sounds. In the 1660s, wealthy Virginians bought all of the good farmland on the coast. Poor colonists couldn't afford land in that area, so they had to work for the wealthy. This made them angry because you could only vote if you owned property at the time. So if you don't own your own land and you're working someone else's, you don't have a say in your government, that's obviously not a great situation. So poor colonists decided to move inland to find land of their own, right? It wouldn't be that great coastal farmland, but it would get the job done. It would suffice, and they would gain voting rights if they had their own land. But obviously that land is already occupied by Native Americans. One poor colonist named Nathaniel Bacon began attacking Native Americans for their land. And the government and the people in Virginia did not support Bacon's moves, right? They wanted to keep things as peaceful as possible with Native Americans, or they didn't want to get into any unnecessary conflicts, let's put it that way. So the governor of Virginia said that Bacon is a rebel. He's making choices as an individual person. We as a government, we as a colony don't support Bacon's stance. Listen, Native Americans, we have nothing to do with this. Bacon got so mad at being called a rebel that then he turned around and attacked Jamestown. Moving past Bacon into the idea of religious toleration. So toleration is the belief and respect that people can have all different sorts of religious backgrounds. People have a right to believe what they want, and no one religion should be forced on a person. So George Calvert, we're taking a little journey through time here. So George Calvert asked King Charles I for a charter to begin a colony where Catholics could live safely. Because remember that Catholics had kind of been getting hated on a little bit since Protestantism popped up. Catholics and Protestants, with Calvert's charter, Catholics and Protestants both colonize the land that later becomes known as Maryland. And initially they worked together peacefully. when Calvert died, his son, Lord Baltimore, yes, Baltimore, Maryland, came into power. And around this time, the peace between Catholics and Protestants seemed to be fading away. There's more tension in the area. So Baltimore is not cool with this. It goes really far against his wishes. So he passes the Religious Toleration Act, which ensures the rights of all Christian men. And if that sounds exclusive, it is, but at the time, this seemed like a big deal. We're saying if you are a Christian, you can practice whatever version of Christianity you want, and we're going to respect that in this area. Moving on to the Carolinas. So North Carolina developed slowly as a colony. It lacked harbors and rivers. It did have small farms that were used to raise and export tobacco. South Carolina, on the other hand, grew much more quickly because sugar and rice grew super successfully here. And we have enslaved people being brought in to help tend crops in this area. And we will get into slavery more in the next few slides and in class together. So looking at Georgia, there are two big reasons that the colony of Georgia was formed. So first of all, there were rumors that Spain, who controlled the colony of Florida at this time, wanted to expand northward. England didn't want that to happen. England wants to control as much land as possible. Georgia's right above Florida. Makes sense. Let's secure that land. Then we have a man named James Oglethorpe, a wealthy Englishman, who decides that he wants a colony that would protect English debtors, or people who owe a lot of money to the government. So the idea crops up that instead of being sent to prison for being in debt, people could be sent to Georgia. Instead of, being punished with time behind bars, you have to help us establish a new colony. So moving on to plantations in the South. So like we said before, the Tidewater region had a warm, humid climate that was good for growing sugar, tobacco, rice, and cotton. Plantations are very large farms developed to tend these crops. And in order to work the plantations, many wealthy plantation owners decided to purchase slaves. We'll look more at the why behind that, but these are crops that really require an enormous amount of labor to maintain, and at the times, plantation owners thought that slave labor was the best source. Instead of hiring 20 people and paying them all an honest day's wage, pay them nothing, keep more money in your own pocket, right? Obviously, that is not the moral way to think, but it's the way that they did think. The plantation system created large gaps between the wealthy and poor in the South, and we're going to be exploring that more in the future. The last slide for today focuses on the backcountry. So the southern backcountry, and backcountry is frontier land, basically. It's the last settled land before you get onto an area that's unsettled, let's say. The southern backcountry was cut off by poor roads and long distances. Families lived on isolated farms, and often they didn't even own the land that they were farming. Families, including women and children, worked their land themselves in the backcountry. They didn't have laborers doing work for them. And really, people in the backcountry started to think that the government only favored wealthy plantation owners. So we're starting to see, even within each colonial region, right, some sort of division. There's wealthy versus poor in the South, and we'll see what role that plays moving forward. But for today, that's all we've got for you. Have a lovely afternoon, guys.